The rain was washing the blood off the porch, but it couldn't drown out the sound of wailing infants. Inside, a notorious Hell's Angel was bleeding out, a loaded Glock in one hand, two newborn twins in the other. What happened next wasn't just a choice, it was a death sentence. Audrey Dempsey gripped the steering wheel of her rusted Honda Civic until her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. It was 10:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the rain in the secluded, heavily forested outskirts of Mendocino County was coming down in blinding, horizontal sheets. At 24, Audrey was 2 semesters away from finishing her nursing degree, but she was also drowning. Between the crippling weight of student loans and her mother's mounting medical bills, sleeping was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she drove, night after night, delivering greasy food and late-night pharmacy runs to the forgotten corners of Northern California. Tonight's order was strange from the start. A high-paying delivery requested through a third-party courier app, 2 large meat lovers' pizzas from a local diner, and an urgent pharmacy pickup consisting of heavy-duty gauze, medical tape, rubbing alcohol, and pediatric Pedialyte. The address was 4490 Old Mill Road, a dead-end dirt path winding deep into the redwood timberlands, miles away from the nearest streetlight or cell tower. Her tires spun, kicking up thick, clay-like mud as she navigated the treacherous incline. The headlights of her Civic cut weakly through the deluge, illuminating towering pines that looked like jagged teeth against the night sky. The radio had dissolved into a sea of static 10 miles back. Audrey's instinct screamed at her to turn around to cancel the order and take the penalty hit on her app. But the tip was pre-authorized for $100. She desperately needed that $100. Finally, the GPS chimed its weak metallic sign-off. You have arrived at your destination. Audrey peered through the rain-streaked windshield. There was no welcoming porch light, no neatly paved driveway. Instead, her headlights illuminated a massive rusted iron gate that had been violently forced open. The thick chain that usually held it shut was lying in the mud, the padlock visibly shattered by what looked like heavy bolt cutters. Beyond the gate sat a sprawling, dilapidated log cabin shrouded in darkness. The yard was a graveyard of chopped firewood, rusted truck axles, and gutted Harley-Davidson motorcycle frames. She put the car in park, leaving the engine running. The rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers did nothing to calm her racing heart. She grabbed the insulated food bag and the plastic pharmacy sack, stepped out into the freezing downpour, and slammed the car door. The silence of the woods was absolute, save for the violent drumming of the storm. As she approached the wooden steps of the wraparound porch, her foot slipped on something slick. She caught her balance against the wooden railing, her flashlight beam cutting down to illuminate the floorboards. It wasn't mud she had slipped on, it was blood. A thick, dark crimson trail was pooling near the welcome mat, actively mixing with the rainwater and spilling over the edge of the stairs. Audrey's breath hitched in her throat. She traced the blood trail up to the heavy oak front door. It wasn't just unlocked, it was splintered completely off its heavy brass hinges, hanging precariously inward at a violent angle. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run back to the Civic, to lock the doors and speed blindly down the mountain. But the nursing student in her, the part of her trained to run toward the crisis, hesitated. Through the crack of the busted door, over the roar of the wind, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a cry, weak, breathless, and unmistakable. A baby, dropping the pizza bag on the porch, but clutching the pharmacy sack. Audrey pushed the splintered door open with a trembling hand. "Hello?" she called out, her voice cracking. "Delivery, is anyone hurt?" The inside of the cabin smelled heavily of old wood, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood and discharged cordite. The living room was a disaster zone. A heavy oak coffee table was flipped on its side. Lamps were shattered, and bullet holes peppered the drywall like a grotesque connect-the-dots puzzle. Behind the overturned table, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through a broken window, sat a giant of a man. He was easily 6'4", his broad chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic gasps. He wore heavily worn denim, heavy engineer boots, and a black leather kutte. Even in the dim light, Audrey recognized the infamous patches. The red and white winged death head skull. The top rocker reading, Hell Zang. The bottom rocker reading, California. He was a fully patched member of the most notorious motorcycle club in the world. But it wasn't the biker that froze Audrey in her tracks. It was what he was holding. In his massive, blood-soaked left arm, tucked tightly against his chest, were two tiny bundles wrapped in a grease-stained Harley-Davidson fleece blanket. Twins. They couldn't have been more than 3 months old. One was crying softly, a weak, reedy sound, while the other was unnervingly silent. In the man's right hand, resting heavily on his knee and pointed directly at Audrey's chest, was a matte black Glock 19. "Close the door," the biker growled. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, wet with the blood pooling in his throat. Audrey froze, her hands slowly rising into the air, the plastic pharmacy bag dangling from her wrist. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. I just brought the delivery," she stammered, her eyes darting between the black barrel of the gun and the pale faces of the infants. "The gauze. The alcohol. You ordered it." The biker's eyes, a piercing, icy blue, locked onto hers. He was heavily tattooed. A sprawling eagle covered his throat, its wings disappearing under his leather collar. His face was rugged, scarred, and currently draining of color at an alarming rate. He looked at the pharmacy bag, then back at her scrubs. He noticed the stethoscope draped carelessly around her neck, a habit from rushing out of her clinical rotations earlier that evening. "You a doctor," he rasped, coughing violently. A fresh wave of crimson spilled from beneath his leather vest, soaking into his white t-shirt. "Nursing student," Audrey said, her voice shaking. "You're bleeding out. Put the gun down, please." "Let me help you." "Name's Victor," he wheezed, his grip on the weapon faltering. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. "Victor Murphy. They call me Grizzly. If you're a nurse, prove it. Save my kids." Audrey didn't wait for another invitation. Her training bypassed her terror. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees in the glass-strewn blood beside the giant biker. Up close, the damage was catastrophic. He had taken a round to the right shoulder, shattering the collarbone, but the real threat was a deep, pulsing entry wound in his lower left abdomen. "I need to call an ambulance," Audrey said, reaching for her cell phone in her scrub pocket. "You have internal bleeding, Victor. You won't make it without surgery." Victor's massive blood-slicked hand suddenly shot out, gripping her wrist with a terrifying, crushing strength. "No cops," he snarled, his eyes flaring with sudden, violent intensity. "No badges, no ambulances. You call a rig. The county gets involved. Child Protective Services takes my boys. Once they're in the system, the men who did this will find them. They'll kill them to get to me. Who did this?" Audrey breathed, terrified by the absolute certainty in his voice. "Ghosts," Victor muttered, his head lolling back against the wall. "Rivals, cartel ghosts. Doesn't matter. They wanted the club's ledger. I burned it, so they came for my bloodline." He looked down at the two fragile bundles in his arm. The tears mixing with the sweat on his face made him look impossibly human, a desperate father hiding beneath the terrifying exterior of a Hell's Angel. "My old lady, she didn't make it. It's just me and the boys now, Liam and Wyatt. You gotta patch me up, sweetheart. I can't leave them." Audrey's mind raced. This was insane. It was highly illegal. But looking at the two infants, Liam crying softly, Wyatt dangerously still and pale, she knew she couldn't just walk away. If she fled, this man would bleed to death on this floor in less than 20 minutes, and the babies would die of exposure or starvation. "Let go of my wrist," Audrey said, her voice dropping an octave, finding a sudden steely resolve she didn't know she possessed. Victor stared at her, surprised by the authority in the young delivery girl's voice, and slowly released his grip. "I need to see the wounds," Audrey commanded. She ripped open the pharmacy bag, pulling out the heavy trauma pads, the medical tape, and the rubbing alcohol. "This is going to hurt like hell, Victor. I don't have anesthetics. I just have pressure and gauze." "Do it," he grunted, biting down on the collar of his leather cut. Audrey worked with frantic precision. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from her pocket, slicing through his ruined t-shirt. The abdominal wound was ugly, a clean through and through, but it had missed the major abdominal aorta by a miracle. Still, he was losing venous blood rapidly. She poured the rubbing alcohol directly into the wound. Victor let out a muffled, agonizing roar, his entire massive frame going rigid. The muscles in his neck strained against his tattoos, but he didn't drop the babies. He held them impossibly gentle, shielding them from his own thrashing body. "Stay with me, Victor. Look at the boys." Audrey yelled over his groans. She packed the wound tightly with the sterile gauze, shoving it deep into the cavity to create internal pressure, then wrapped his midsection tightly with wide strips of medical tape. She did the same for his shattered shoulder, stabilizing the joint as best as she could. By the time she finished, Audrey was covered in his blood, up to her elbows. She was panting, her scrubs ruined. She checked his pulse. It was thready, fast, but the massive hemorrhaging had slowed to a manageable seep. "Now let me see the babies," she demanded gently. Victor, exhausted and hovering on the edge of consciousness, slowly lowered his arm. Audrey reached out, carefully taking the bundles from him. They were so light, practically weightless. She unwrapped the fleece blanket. Liam was fussy, his face red, clearly hungry. But Wyatt was cool to the touch, his breathing incredibly shallow. Audrey's heart sank. "He's too cold, Victor. He's going into hypothermic shock." "How long was the door open?" "An hour," Victor whispered, his eyes closing. "Since the gunfight. Power's been cut. I have the heater running in my car," Audrey said, making a split-second decision. "I'm taking them to the Civic. I'll warm up the Pedialyte in the dashboard vents. I'll come back for you. We have to get you all out of here." Victor nodded weakly. "My keys?" "In my pocket. There's a safe house. I'll give you the directions. Just keep them warm." Audrey secured the two babies against her chest, wrapping them tightly in her dry fleece jacket. She stood up, preparing to make the dash back out into the freezing rain to her idling Honda. But as she took her first step toward the ruined doorway, the living room suddenly lit up. Twin beams of piercing white light swept across the broken windows, casting long, terrifying shadows across the bullet-riddled walls. The heavy, unmistakable rumble of two diesel engines reverberated through the floorboards, completely overpowering the sound of the thunderstorm. The grinding of heavy mud tires chewing up the gravel driveway signaled their arrival. Victor's eyes snapped open, a flash of pure, unadulterated terror crossing the hardened biker's face. "Audrey," Victor rasped, struggling to lift the heavy Glock from the floor with his good hand. "Get in the basement, now." "Who is it?" Audrey whispered, clutching the babies so tightly she could feel their tiny heartbeats against her ribs. "They didn't get what they wanted," Victor said, cocking the gun as heavy boots hit the porch outside. "They came back to finish the job." The floorboards groaned under the weight of the intruder's boots. Audrey's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Victor, who had somehow propped himself up against the ruined wall, his bloody finger resting on the trigger of his Glock. "Go," Victor mouthed, his eyes blazing with a feral protective fury. Behind the kitchen, the iron door. Clutching the two tiny bundles to her chest, Audrey scrambled backward, her rubber-soled sneakers slipping on the blood-slicked hardwood. She rounded the kitchen island just as the front door was kicked the rest of the way in, the heavy oak shattering against the interior wall. Flashlight beams, blindingly bright, pierced the gloom, slicing through the dust and gun smoke. "Clear the main room," a sharp, accented voice barked. "Find the biker. Find the kids. Leave nothing breathing." Audrey found the iron door. It was heavy, industrial, and cold to the touch. She threw her weight against the rusted handle, slipping inside just as a barrage of suppressed gunfire chewed through the drywall where she had been standing seconds before. She closed the heavy door silently behind her, plunging herself into absolute suffocating darkness. She was at the top of a wooden staircase. The air down here smelled of damp earth, motor oil, and old leather. Carefully, blindly, she navigated the steep steps, terrified that a single creak of the wood would give away her position. Against her chest, Liam began to squirm. His tiny face was scrunched up, and a whimpering cry was bubbling up in his throat. Wyatt, terrifyingly, remained limp and freezing. "Shh, shh, please," Audrey whispered, her voice trembling. She reached the dirt floor of the basement and ducked behind what felt like a massive stack of motorcycle tires and heavy steel toolboxes. She had to quiet Liam and she had to warm Wyatt. Operating entirely by touch, she unzipped her fleece jacket slightly, pressing Wyatt's cold, bare skin directly against her chest to transfer her core body heat. Then she reached into the plastic pharmacy bag dangling from her wrist. She found the small bottle of infant Pedialy. Using her teeth, she popped the plastic seal. It was cold, but it was all she had. Upstairs, all hell broke loose. "Grizzly," a voice taunted. "We know you're bleeding out. The ledger is gone, but my boss wants your bloodline erased. Hand over the bastards, and I'll put a bullet in your head instead of your gut. It'll be quick." Victor didn't answer with words. He answered with the deafening roar of his Glock 19. The heavy, unsuppressed booms shook the dust from the basement ceiling. Shouts of pain and anger erupted above. Heavy bodies hit the floorboards, followed by the rapid, sickening thwit, thwit, thwit of automatic, suppressed return fire. In the basement, Audrey dipped her pinky finger into the Pedialy and placed it inside Liam's mouth. The baby instantly latched on, suckling frantically, his cries muffled by his desperate hunger. It bought her seconds, but as she huddled in the dark, a thin sliver of light suddenly cut across the basement floor. The iron door at the top of the stairs had been yanked open. "Check the cellar," a voice commanded. Heavy, tactical boots began to descend the wooden steps. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight swept across the room, illuminating stacks of Harley-Davidson crankcases, rows of rusted exhaust pipes, and finally, stopping just inches from the stack of tires where Audrey was hiding. Audrey's blood turned to ice. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the baby so tight against her that she feared she might hurt them. She could hear the man's breathing. He was close. Too close. He racked the slide of his weapon, the metallic clack echoing in the cramped space. "Come out, little rabbits," the man sneered softly, his boots crunching on the dirt floor as he rounded the perimeter of the room. "I can smell the fear." Audrey looked down at her hands. She had the heavy steel trauma shears she'd used to cut Victor's shirt, and she had the half-empty bottle of 90% isopropyl rubbing alcohol. It wasn't much against an automatic weapon, but she wasn't going to let this man touch the children. She carefully unscrewed the cap of the alcohol bottle, gripping the heavy steel shears in her other hand. The flashlight beam hit her sneaker. The man stepped around the tires, his weapon raised. He was dressed in black tactical gear, his face obscured by a neoprene mask. For a split second, shock registered in his eyes. He expected a giant Hell's Angel, not a terrified, blood-soaked girl in nursing scrubs holding two babies. That split second of hesitation was all Audrey needed. With a desperate primal scream, Audrey lunged upward. She hurled the open bottle of isopropyl alcohol directly at his face. The potent chemical splashed across his eyes and soaked into his mask. The man shrieked in agony, his hands instinctively flying to his burning eyes, his finger jerking the trigger and sending a wild spray of bullets into the ceiling. Before he could recover, Audrey swung the heavy trauma shears with everything she had, driving the blunt, heavy steel handle directly into his temple. The man crumpled like a rag doll, hitting the dirt floor hard and dropping his rifle. Breathing heavily, Audrey didn't wait to see if he would get up. She noticed a faint draft of cold air coming from the far wall. Behind a tarp covering a dismantled motorcycle frame, there was a rusted set of Bilko storm doors leading outside. She hoisted the babies higher on her chest, kicked away the heavy iron latch, and pushed the doors open, bursting out into the freezing torrential rain. The storm was unrelenting. Audrey scrambled up the muddy embankment from the cellar, slipping and sliding, her knees completely coated in thick red clay. She was at the side of the cabin, shrouded in the darkness of the redwoods. Peeking around the corner of the house, she saw them. Two massive, matte black Ford F-250s were idling in the driveway, their high beams illuminating her rusted Honda Civic. Three heavily armed men were standing by the trucks, their weapons trained on the front door of the cabin, waiting for their men inside to finish the job. Audrey was trapped. She couldn't make a run for her car without crossing directly through their headlights. Suddenly, the front window of the cabin exploded outward. A massive, heavy oak chair came flying through the glass, followed immediately by the towering, blood-soaked figure of Victor. He tackled one of the armed men off the porch, the two of them crashing into the mud in a brutal, desperate tangle of limbs. Victor was fighting with the strength of a dead man walking. Despite his shattered shoulder and his gunshot abdomen, the Hell's Angel was a force of pure, terrifying nature. He ripped the rifle from the man's hands, driving his heavy engineer boot into the attacker's chest. But he was vastly outnumbered. The other two men at the trucks raised their weapons, taking aim at the wounded biker. Victor, Audrey screamed involuntarily, stepping out from the shadows. The men snapped their attention toward her, their rifles pivoting. Audrey froze, entirely exposed in the rain, clutching Liam and Wyatt. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the gunshot never came. Instead, the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, guttural hum deep in the forest, a sound so deep it rattled the teeth in Audrey's skull. Within seconds, the hum escalated into a deafening, earth-shattering roar. Through the tree line, a dozen blinding headlights tore through the rain and mud. They erupted into the driveway like a mechanized cavalry from hell. 15 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, engines screaming, completely surrounded the black trucks. The riders were massive, clad in heavy leather, their death head patches soaked by the rain. The cartel hitmen didn't stand a chance. Before the men could even raise their rifles toward the bikers, the Hell's Angels descended. The air was split with the deafening crack of heavy-caliber handguns. It was a chaotic, violent blur of leather, steel, and blood. In less than 30 seconds, the hit squad was neutralized, their black trucks riddled with holes. The roar of the engines cut out, replaced only by the pouring rain and the hiss of cooling motorcycle pipes. A giant of a man with a graying beard and a president rocker on his vest stepped off his bike. He walked over to where Victor lay in the mud. Victor was staring up at the sky, gasping for air, his life slipping away. "You held the line, Grizzly," the president said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. He looked up, his sharp eyes locking onto Audrey, who was standing frozen against the side of the house, the twins wrapped in her bloody fleece. The president walked toward her. Audrey took a step back, terrified, but the man simply reached out, his massive hands calloused and scarred, and gently pulled the blanket back. Liam was awake, staring up at the rain. Wyatt's color was slowly returning, his breathing steady, saved by the warmth of Audrey's chest. "You, the one who patched him up?" the president asked, looking at Audrey's blood-soaked scrubs. Audrey nodded, unable to speak. "You saved his bloodline," the biker said, his voice thick with an unexpected emotion. He turned to the other men. "Boone, get Grizzly in the chase truck. Tell Doc we're coming in hot. He needs surgery. 5 minutes ago." Two bikers sprinted forward, carefully lifting Richter's massive frame and hauling him toward a heavy SUV that had just pulled into the driveway behind the bikes. The president gently took the two babies from Audrey's arms, holding them with an almost reverent care. "Go home, sweetheart," the president said softly, looking back at Audrey. "You never saw us. You were never here. But the club. We don't forget." Audrey didn't argue. She numbly walked to her Civic, her legs feeling like lead. She got in, locked the doors, and backed out of the chaotic yard, driving down the treacherous mountain road until the adrenaline finally wore off and she had to pull over to vomit on the side of the highway. Andren, life returned to a bizarre, mundane normal. Audrey went back to her clinicals. She never reported the incident. She scrubbed her Honda Civic with bleach until her hands bled, washing away the remnants of that terrifying night on Old Mill Road. She watched the local news obsessively, but there was no mention of a shootout, no bodies found, no biker wars. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed the violence whole. 6 months later, Audrey was sitting at her cramped kitchen table, exhausted after a 12-hour shift at the hospital. She was staring at a pile of past-due bills, her mother's oncology statements, and her final tuition notice. She was exactly $4,000 short, and the bank had denied her final loan extension. She put her head in her hands and wept. A heavy knock at the door startled her. She wiped her eyes and walked to the door, looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Slowly, she unchained the lock and opened it. Sitting on her welcome mat was a plain brown cardboard box. Sitting on top of the box was a single, pristine white lily and a child's silver pacifier. Audrey's heart skipped a beat. She pulled the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. With trembling hands, she cut the tape. Inside, neatly stacked in thick, rubber-banded bundles, were crisp, unmarked $100 bills. Hundreds of them, easily enough to pay off her mother's treatments, her tuition, and her car. Resting on top of the money was a piece of heavy black cardstock. Written on it in silver metallic marker were just 2 lines. "Wyatt's laughing now. Liam's walking. Debt paid. Grizzly and the boys." Audrey stared at the note, a tear slipping down her cheek and landing on the stacks of cash. She had driven into a nightmare to deliver a pizza, and somehow she had walked out with her future handed back to her by the most dangerous men in California. If this heart-pounding story of an ordinary delivery driver thrown into the dangerous world of the Hells Angels kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, true-life dramas and shocking twists. Ring the notification bell so you never miss a thrilling drop. See you in the next one.